Hi everyone, welcome to Philosophical Communication online meeting. Today we as Group 5 will bring some presentation about beyond the doctrine of science. Before we jump into the presentation, let me introduce myself, Basyaasyah as speaker number 1, my friend Natasya as speaker number 2, and my friend Alex as speaker number 3. So without any further ado, let's get started.
What is semiotics? Let's learn about that. Semiotics occupy an odd position in pure philosophical sense. On the other hand, it is clear that questions concerning science and semiosis are topics of main interest to him in both first and end writing. It can be very difficult to understand what role semiotics are actually intended to play in pure scientific philosophy, as well as in the way the theoretical foundation of science are understood. While he can explain in detail, seek satisfying definition, and carefully classify science, he also leaves things unresolved, leaving somewhat disturbing gaps in the theory that might be height of this glory. This discussion principally concerns the semiotic concept, namely question of how the central term, starting with semiotic itself, is to be understood. This was no small matter for Priest. He argues that an important phase of the effort to create to create a scientific philosophy is the reform of his vocabulary. The challenge is to develop concepts that do not cut the lifeline to experiential reality through over formalism, turning the entire company into a big game, but which remain precise and explicit enough to drive the advancement of the research community.
Logic in the broad sense. In a sketchy manuscript titled Teleological Logic, semiotic is characterized as the science of representations, one of the branches in a basic trivium of sciences that also includes positive science and formal science. Peirce also classified logics by delimiting the domain of his research to the study of the relations of symbolic representations to their object. Thus, it can be called the science of truth. The third branch may be called semiotics, or the doctrine of science, the most usual whereof being words. It is aptly enough termed also logic. Logic, the business whereof is to consider the nature of science. The mind makes use of the understanding of things, or conveying its knowledge to others. Peirce doubts that he has two viable options: designed logic in a broader sense as semiotic and keep the term logic for narrower acceptance, or use a term like criticism to denote a distinction from logic in a broad sense, namely semiotic. The highest category of the symbol one which signifies a growth, self-development of thought, and it is of the alone that a moving representation is possible. And the main problem of logic is to state whether one thought given is true and becomes an extension of other given or not. In other words, it is the critics of arguments. An easy solution is to simply state that Peircean semiotics is the general doctrine of science, covering the entire field of semiotics, whatever may be involved. The fluctuation between doctrinal and scientific viewpoints in their characterization in the field of semiotics can be attributed to two different purposes. On the other hand, Peirce wants to show the existence of a historical continuum, but besides that, he wants to incorporate semiotics into the overall scheme of science in order to emphasize future prospects in this field of inquiry. Normative semiotic on the ladder of science. Peirce argues that the arrangement of his knowledge is designed as a natural classification. The most important characteristic of the Peircean scientist is the sincere desire for truth, which can be interpreted as the general end cause of science. Peirce's uncertainty about the prospective sciences may explain why sometimes he prefers the denomination the doctrine of science. He also admits that the sign of science remains a desideratum. These are presumed predominant category can be marked as follows. First is way of being what you are, positively and without reference to anything else. The second is a way of being from what it is, with respect to one second but no matter a third. And the last one is the way of having what it is and bringing the second and third into relation to each other. Grammar and rhetoric. Peirce proposed to divide semiotic research into three compartments. First is critical logic, second is grammar, third is rhetoric. This trichotomy is the most enduring of all the other disciplines. All branches of semiotics are concerned with all kinds of science and not just symbols.
Grammar. The function of grammar is to study ways of marking in general or to study the ways in which something can be scientified. Grammar studies the convolution of signs that have a significant or meaningful character. The basic component of his initial analysis of the representational relation, namely, first is ground, second is object, and third is interpretant. Rhetoric. Rhetoric is the beginning and end of semiotics, and grammar becomes a medium for adding rhetorical practice to our communication. The task of the rhetoric is to ascertain the laws of law through every scientific intelligence, one sign which gives birth to another sign, and primarily one to give birth to another sign. Rhetoric is a more fundamental semiotics, also in philosophy in general, that we are accustomed to. Critical logic, grammar, rhetoric, these three things turn out to be the main topics of semiotics, but can be distinguished based on a certain hierarchy. Relationship that can be simplified. Later theoretical category will be related to phenomenology. Phenomenology comes from experience, which is central to philosophy. But in reality, phenomenology only sees the state of appearance and turns a blind eye to certain studies. So it is difficult or cannot be used as a positive science. The hallmark of Peirce's sign problem is genetic semiotics. The content is simple. The premise is simple. That is, the relationship of signs is an unsimplified tradition. Through simple mathematics, Peirce explained his tradition thesis. He summarized three phenomenological concepts into 2 points. First, the sufficient theorem, which is one or more signs. Second is the theorem without reduction consists of less than 3 signs. Through this concept, it can be interpreted that the conception of the relationships between signs. Perhaps it can be obtained through mathematics, grammar through phenomenology to detect the relationships between the 3 signs.
Problem of formalism. The deep search for sign often takes on ambiguous meanings. Therefore, Peirce's goal is to find common, logically significant investigations. Representation is the relationship of the one thing to another object. It can be another object or sign. In these connections, there are 3 elements, namely as written above. First, interpreter thought. Second is sign. And the third is motorcycle taxis. The existence of these 3 elements can be called a semiotic formalism. Problem of formalism. Philosophy must also be able to give words with the same meaning in philosophy itself to find the meaning of these words. It was the voice of rhetorical philosophy. Peirce's overall attitude towards realism and philosophy is quite ambiguous. He frequently criticized philosophers such as his pragmatic colleague James and F.C.S. Hitler for their lack of appreciation for constancy and abstraction. Peirce was a pioneer in formal logic, but he avoided formalism beyond logical inquiry. He proved that formal logic should not be too purely formal or degenerate into a mathematical regression. Peirce claims that the failure of many philosophers is due to their tendency to imitate mathematics. This is why Peirce stressed into the formalistic section, namely that he puts forward a theory when sign can be understood and deduction from a small number of principles resulting in a purely formal conception. Such a formalistic opinion is doomed to fail when confronted with the experiential basis of semiotic concepts. A rhetorical approach to the sign. If a formalistic strategies are deemed insufficient, there are 2 genuine alternatives. The first is we choose to part with Peirce, and the second, we seek another path. The road of acceptance to the generally satisfactory conception of the sign is not necessarily a complete substitute, but is used as a complement and corrective version to articulate the mathematical theory conception of the sign in a firm and categorical manner. This is the bottom-up approach is in question, named starting from semiotic experience into mathematical or grammatical forms. This is called a rhetorical perspective. Peirce says everything is actually put together. It is aimed at sides of different but related experience. Indonesia case from 2019 to 2021. This is an example of a fire case that happened in August 2020. After investigation, the cause of this incident was the still burning cigarettes butts belonging to the workers who were working on the building project. As for the evidence that triggered the fire, namely items with flammable categories such as iron glue, floor cleaning fluid, and thinner. In this case, it can be said that this incident was the mistakes of the workers and the foreman of the building. Why is said so? Because basically in a building project, there is a rule which is generally called OHS or Occupational Health and Safety that should be obeyed. Thus, it indicates that the workers did not comply with the applicable regulation, resulting in a fire at the Kejaksaan Agung building. Relation between the case to the subject. The relationship between the case study that we choose and the material we raise, namely semiotic, is the use of occupational health and safety, or OHS signs that are prohibited from smoking in the lives around us, which are the implementation or application of one of the semiotic signs, namely the study of symbols, signs, and so on, with the aim of being an accompaniment or a message that will later be conveyed to everyone who see the safety sign, so that they can maintain safety and prevent fires. However, there needs to be a learning about understanding and continuous discipline from everyone towards the safety signs that are around them as form of application of semiotics, which is also included in the large scope of communication science.
Okay, that's all for today's presentation. Thank you for watching. See you next time.